All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Continuous Discussions, the online forum where we talk about Agile, DevOps, and continuous delivery. I'm Sam Fell.
And I'm Anders Wahlgren, and today's topic is model-driven pipelines. Organizations practicing DevOps and continuous delivery quickly realize the value in leaning out their tool chains in operations. And by that, I mean, obviously, well, not so obviously, because we talked about it before, and it's not obvious, but leaning out as in not the opposite of leaning in, but lean as in lean manufacturing, lean software, lean processes, those kinds of things.
And that's why we put it in quotes.
Yeah, the value in leaning out their tool chains and operations. However, they also find that rigid standardization can kill creativity and innovation and makes developers mad. Abstraction and modeling can help. What are some ways teams can create a structure for the pipeline while still providing adequate adaptability, security, compliance, and governance at scale?
Awesome. And we have some fantastic panelists joining us to talk today about this model-driven behavior. The first one is a friend of the firm, Helen Beal. Say hello.
Hi, everyone.
And a little bit of background.
Oh, a little bit of background. So I'm Helen, as I said. I work at Range 4. I am a DevOpsologist, by which I mean I study DevOps all day long. I do coaching and training around DevOps practices and principles, and I also act as product owner at the DevOps Institute. Lovely.
Well, we're happy to have you here. It's wonderful. You and I, we've been trading emails for such a long time, and it's nice to finally meet you in quote unquote in person. I put it like leaning out, I put in quotes, I put in person in quotes as well. Well, wonderful. Thanks for joining us. Matthew Skelton, introduce yourself, please.
Hi. So I'm Matthew Skelton. I'm head of consulting at Conflux, and I help organizations to improve their practices around continuous delivery and software operability in particular, so within a kind of DevOps context. I've written some books. I speak quite a bit at conferences, and I also help with organizations with how their teams interrelate. So the kind of team topologies and how those can work together to be more effective. I've done a lot of work recently in the space around deployment pipelines, which is why I'm glad to be here today.
Wonderful. Well, we're very happy to have you as well. And if I haven't asked you to introduce yourself, it's because you're not a panelist. However, we still want to hear from you. Use the hashtag C9D9 on Twitter to make yourself heard. And with that, let's get started with the conversation. So you think about modeling a pipeline and you think about sort of that pipeline evolution. Let's talk a little bit about where are pipelines? Where did they come from? And how are we thinking about them as we move into the age of DevOps? So you see on this little screenshot here, we've got run books, we've got the spaghetti script monster, and we move into flexible sort of model-based activities and model-based systems. Tell me a little bit. I got Matthew on my screen when I come back from my slide. So Matthew, tell us a little bit about that pipeline evolution and what you're seeing with your clients.
So the concept of deployment pipeline was popularized by Jez Hummel and Dave Farley in the book Continuous Delivery, published in 2010. That's where the terminology was really solidified around there. And some people have been building what ended up being called deployment pipelines. They've been building that since about 2005, something like this. So the concepts and the practices and things are quite well mature now. But it wasn't really deployment pipeline wasn't a thing as a concept until 2010 with the Hummel and Farley book, and it was extremely useful in my opinion for how they characterize what that deployment pipeline is. It's that route to live. It's that bit from version control to the production environment, or as close to production as we can get in some cases if we're working in embedded or we're working in somewhere where we can't deploy all the time.
Right.
But that kind of bit in the middle, which is like the key middle bit of the kind of value stream for software development. And the way they characterized it was so good in terms of the moving parts, in terms of the fact that almost everything was automated, but you could still have some manual gates in there if you needed a manual decision. So it was such a really good way of characterizing a whole load of really good practices, which lots of people are already doing, but they just called it a thing, and they put some sort of parameters around it and made it really easy to understand and define what we mean by deployment pipeline. So it was super useful to have that as a starting point for thinking about deployment pipelines and building them.
Right. Absolutely. So helping to understand that model, if you will, the pattern of a pipeline. But back in the day, how were people thinking about doing it? Right. Helen, what are your thoughts on that?
So prior to Range 4, I spent 4 years working with a deployment automation vendor, and that took me into some really interesting places. I'm thinking in particular, when you put Runbook up there, it made me wryly smile, because I remembered going to one of the big Swiss banks and them showing me their Runbook, which was essentially a spreadsheet of a list of things that happened. And it was quite useful because it enabled us to understand the difference between release and deploy in their world, which changes from organization to organization. Some people deploy and then release, and some people have a release process that happens before they do the automated deployment. So it does vary. And around that time as well, people were starting to look more seriously at deployment automation tools. So I went into lots of organizations and had conversations with people who created what I call the script monster, like you just said. So what I learned was that people tended to be doing these same old manual tasks over and over again. And one afternoon they'd get bored, so they would write a bit of script and then a bit more script and a bit more script. And over time, it built into this horrible script monster that was quite dangerous. So I remember having a chat with one of the health and insurance organizations in the States at an IBM event, actually, in Las Vegas. And we were talking about them moving from this script monster they had to a deployment automation tool. And it was a really interesting conversation because they knew there was some risk associated with it, but because they were doing like a big upgrade of MQ7 to 8 or something. But their opinion was that actually it was less risky to try and do an upgrade like that using a new deployment tool than using this script monster they'd already had. And the really interesting thing was when we talked to them about risk, they said this could be a life or death thing. And I hadn't really thought about that. You think of life or death stuff in some organizations. But they said, if we get this wrong and we issue the wrong medicine to somebody, that could be really bad. And so that was really interesting to see them. But they were quite forward thinking, because what we also observed was a lot of people that had created these script monsters. And in my experience, it was often the same person. I think Matthew's had experiences where he's seen different people, or you've seen different people contribute to them, but often it was the same person. And they'd see it as their kind of baby. So we'd kind of go in and say, script monster, bit dangerous, bit of a single point of failure. And they'd get upset because we'd called their baby.
Yeah.
And the other thing was they were in a position of such safety because they knew so much about this thing and they were the only person. So that classic IT hero syndrome that we see such a lot, where people kind of come in on their stallion at the 2 in the morning when everything's broken and fix it. But life really shouldn't be like that. I think we'd all agree.
Brent. Yeah. Right.
Yes, Brent. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when I first started in the industry in the 80s, we built every night on like 35 different platforms at the time. It was a text search product back in the 80s. And people thought we were crazy. Like, what are you doing building all these things? And then fast forward to 2004, I'm working at Electric Cloud. We're doing build acceleration and industrial CI and all these kinds of things. And I'm doing a seminar, and a person in the back of the room puts his hand up and says, "What do you do with all these builds?" And I said, "Well, they get tested." "Oh, no, they don't, I'm like, okay, but we run unit tests for, like, the concept that you would build except to, like, release the product was foreign to some people back then, right? This whole notion of we're going to do
why do all this extra work?
Yeah, right. The idea that we're going to do this so frequently that we get good at it, is that notion took a while to sort of stick in people's minds. Now, obviously, it has. But
and that was one of the things that Dave and Jez talked about in the book, right? If something is painful, do it more often, right? And make it just an automated thing that just sort of happens.
Yeah.
So you remove that, you operationalize it so that is a non-variable that you don't have to worry about. And the only variable is really the new code or whatever.
And it changes completely the way that engineers work. I mean, never mind ops and all of that too. I mean, one experience that I had very early on in my career was we worked with Lotus Notes. And those guys, gals, I think it was mostly guys at that time, unfortunately, but their process was very interesting because they would all go off, a number of them, and write code independently for 6 weeks. And then they would come back together and basically spend the next 6 weeks just trying to make it all compile. Right? So it, it's kind of nice how far we've gotten, to the extent that we're not, all the way there.
And I'm sure if I ask folks in the audience to raise their hand and say, do you ever have this happen to you? There's going to be a very large percentage of people who probably still have that happen. They've got branches that sit and they run, and they haven't followed the advice from folks like Jez and saying, no long-lived branches, right? Yeah. That's not a great idea.
Yeah, which, I mean, and that's changing a little bit, I would say, with distributed versioning systems, because kind of everything is a branch at some point in a distributed versioning system, but short-lived is kind of the key, as always. But,
right.
Yeah, what do you do with all those bills?
Right.
I think it's an interesting point, and what we're seeing here is with starting with kind of continuous integration as a concept back in, God, when was that? Well, at least early 2000s, possibly before that, but certainly the first build servers that were coming out, like cruise control and so on, back in the early 2000s. It's the first sort of phase of what you might call taking some more of an industrial approach, if you like, to aspects of what we're doing. I don't mean that it becomes completely regular, because that's not what software is, but seeing the value in automating stuff and getting fast feedback from being able to automate it and fix problems really, really quickly. That kind of mindset, which is very, very different from kind of tinkering away with code until it might be ready, and then perhaps we'll kind of work out and come together. And if we can be bothered, like bring that code together, integrate it with other people's code. It's a very different mindset. We're proving ourselves all the time. Much more kind of scientific kind of way of doing it. Let's try and falsify this hypothesis by running a whole lot of tests against it, and we'll get the results. And if it fails, it's not a problem. It's not my it's not that I'm a bad coder. If the test fails, that's actually a good thing, because it's found something that I couldn't see before. It's a very different kind of mindset to how a lot of people have worked in the past, I guess, with software in this way. So I think it's a great step forward, because we can now we're not worried about producing huge numbers of artifacts and binaries, because it's fine. We've got some nice clear down patterns that we can just run against our artifact repository. Very, very simple stuff. Has it ever been used is the first one. When I was working at a place in London, a few years ago, we had an artifact repository. It was distributed across 4 or 5 different sites across the world, because we had a distributed team, and so we needed to manage the number of artifacts quite carefully in the pipeline. And the first rule we implemented in terms of clear down of all those artifacts was, has it ever been used? Has that package ever been used, or has that artifact been used? And we found that 70% of the stuff was never used, because there was a new version that came on afterwards, and so that one was used. It was super simple, and our clear down policy was just, if it's never been used, just get rid of it, and after a period of time. And so that's just an example of the kind of way which, if we started to make things more, if you like, industrial, more repeatable, more automated, we can apply rules like this, and some of the problems that would have been crazy in the past, if we'd have been doing manual builds and keeping all that stuff, they just go away, because we've automated the hell out of it. So it's nice to be in this position where we're taking these kind of patterns, making things more automated, we're able to build more useful assumptions on top of our automated, more industrialized kind of tooling and ways of working, and do things in a much better way. And that's the real value, one of the real key values about deployment pipelines in this space.
Yeah, and I think touching back on one of the things you said is the ability to sort of experiment, where if you have this automated pipeline and you can sort of depend on the repeatability of it, and the consistency of, if you put the exact same things in, you'll get the exact same stuff out. Once you get to that point, anything you put in that's different becomes a hypothesis that you're testing. And whether it's a failure or a success, it's still a success as long as you're able to see it. And I think that's such an important and powerful part of this whole pipeline concept, and the ability to model out things so that it doesn't have to be exactly the same thing that's going in. But if I'm moving something to AWS that used to be on premise, the work that has to happen to make it work on premise versus AWS may be slightly different. But as long as you've tested that portion before and you've abstracted that away, then the developer or the engineer or the SRE who's trying to get this thing promoted to wherever they need to promote it to can reuse that same sort of model and be confident that the thing that I'm testing is not the model, it's the change that I made. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think we're getting to the point too where your pipeline for your software is in some ways a very important feature of your software, right? I mean, whatever form your pipeline takes, whether it's, fully end-to-end automated, with one of our products, or whether it's, open source, or whether it's, Bob in the corner who runs the scripts with 64 arguments, only he knows which ones are for what. You have one. And it is kind of, it becomes a very important feature of the product, because ultimately you don't ship if you don't have one and if it doesn't work. So having the ability to make it adaptable, having the ability to make it kind of grow along with you and change as you change your tooling, change as you change your architecture, all of those things are kind of key. Because otherwise you find, you don't want to find yourself bound into a particular architecture just because of your pipeline. Oh, we use Java, therefore we have to use this, or we use Python, therefore we have to use that.
Yeah.
That limits you a lot, and especially when we're starting to do, all these loosely coupled architectures, microservices, container-based, all of these kinds of things. There's going to be a majillion different kinds of tools out there that are being used.
Yeah.
And then tool-specific pipelines are getting to be a little bit painful.
Yeah, and treating that pipeline, like you said, treating it like a product or a part of your product is an important way to be able to version control the pipeline.
Yeah.
You have a minimum viable pipeline. You say, here's what I'm going to start with, and I'm going to pack more stuff into it. I'm going to burn down bugs that are existing in my pipeline, or I'm going to change my architecture of the pipeline to support a change in the architecture of my product.
And hopefully if you've got, 50 products or 500 products or 5,000 products, those pipelines share a lot with each other. You're not building a new one from scratch every time. The DNA is 99.9% the same, but it's all those different bits that make it interesting.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that's fantastic. And if you think about that pipeline then as a value stream, which sort of is what we've been talking about, that also helps, and this was one of the points, Matthew, that you had brought up before we started, is it helps to align everybody around what the value is that you're trying to deliver and what people's participation is and what their role is, or what the different teams or the technology's role is in actually providing that value. And so I know that you guys have experience doing some of this value stream work. So Helen, I'm going to start with you and ask you a little bit about how are you seeing companies treating that pipeline like a value stream?
So we do a lot of value stream mapping. We were quite delighted at Range 4 actually when the DevOps Handbook came out, because it also places value stream mapping as a really important tool to get started on any kind of DevOps evolution. And we've been doing it and using it in that way for quite some time. So we were pretty happy when that thought seemed to be rubber stamped, if you like. So it's an incredibly powerful tool, because it usually gets a bunch of people in the room that hardly ever get in the same room together, and they start looking at things and understanding things in a way that they just haven't understood before. So sort of Eric from the Phoenix Project's words about getting profound understanding of the system and that kind of TPS lean thinking is what it's all about at its core. So when we think about DevOps tool chains and continuous delivery pipelines and a product, a software product being delivered, we do use kind of the end-to-end linear terminology, but actually sometimes it's helpful to think of the pipeline more like a loop, because we're going round it and round it and round it as fast as we can. But either way, the value stream mapping exercise enables us to really see where those constraints are and where that waste is. So whether it's the separate testing team that they've got, or having to wait for the business to come in and do UAT, or they haven't got a decent cloud environment, so doing environment provisioning and things are really painful. It just really helps to surface that sort of pain. So as I said earlier, actually, I did actually do one yesterday with one of the UK banks, and we uncovered all sorts of stuff. And this whole conversation as well about quality and defects. And when we do value stream mapping, we start from the moment the idea is had, and we take it all the way through to the value realization. So you also uncover these conversations about things like, is a defect actually a poorly defined requirement? And how is that what many heritage organizations call waterfall, but is actually kind of chaos? How is that working? And
I gotta write that down.
Yeah. I'm going to quote you on that one. That's brilliant.
So yeah, I think Matthew, you've probably done a lot of VSM work as well. I don't know if you start in the same place that we do, or where you start.
Yeah, we've done quite a lot, and it's always very revealing for the organization, for the people in the team. We've for a team of, let's say it's a software development team, then we would tend to start just with version control and watch the flow of change going into production, because actually, as you said, it's really valuable to extend it further left, if you like. So back towards kind of requirements and business requirements and so on, and that's useful to do too, particularly if you're working with stakeholders, if you like, higher up in the organization or with more responsibility at least.
It helps to track the why. Why are we doing this? Why is the value stream being instantiated? Yeah,
exactly. But even if you just take it from version control to production, making sure that people can see that journey from version control to production. Sorry, if you flip it on its head, for those organizations that do not represent that visually, that do not have a single tool that actually controls that flow, generally end up in a pickle. This is what I see time and time again. When they've segmented that flow from at least for version control into production with several different tools, or where the tools are just it's not possible to visualize or see what's going on. You have to kind of go into some crazy tool over here, run a little manual script to kick off the next phase. That kind of stuff it wastes so much time. It causes so much confusion, makes onboarding very difficult, makes diagnostics very difficult. People are not thinking about it as if it's a proper thing. This is our mechanism for software, for value delivery. Why would we not want to invest in this thing in a way which surfaces on?
It's not even necessarily just technical issues that you're uncovering. You know, it's business issues, it's functionality.
Exactly.
issues.
Exactly. It's exactly the reason to do it, and exactly the reason to put in place what Jez Hubble and Dave Farley call a walking skeleton deployment pipeline, where we initially in a tool or whichever tool we're using, we just create a series of steps that model the current flow. If we've got 17 different test stages, we have 17 different stages in our deploy pipeline to start with, and we have that conversation with people saying, is this what you really want? Are you sure this is exactly what you need? And even if loads of stuff's not automated, then we can just actually model that flow through into production. It allows us to get, it allows us to solve a lot of the challenges with security, network partitioning, different kind of access requirements for different teams. If you need security clearance for one area and all this sort of stuff, we can solve that stuff out. And all we're deploying to start with is readme.txt. That's the one file. We just deploy that one file. Let's see what happens. Because if we can solve that challenge, there's a whole lot of stuff we've already solved. Yeah. And then we can deploy hello world.java, and then we can deploy something a bit more interesting. But the key thing is we're not leaving that till the very end.
Now, of course, you're showing your age, because today that would be a readme.md, not a readme.txt.
That's true.
It all kind of reminds me of the, I don't know if you've ever watched the South Park cartoon show, but they had an episode many years ago called The Underwear Gnomes. And their business plan was step number 1, collect underwear. Step number 3, profit. They hadn't really worked out step number 2 yet. And to me, that's value stream mapping, right? It's like, what is your step number 2? Have you really thought about this? What do you want it to be?
Right. And Helen, you were mentioning that you got about a bunch of different people in the room for the exercise that you were running just yesterday. What were some of the titles of some of those people that were in that room?
I'm going to tell you in a minute, but I'm going to tell you first that I once made my mother watch South Park, which was a huge mistake. She didn't one of my favourite programs. That Who Killed Kenny? He was like my favourite. Remember him and the little
Kenny? Yeah.
He was just gorgeous. Yeah, my mother, who was a teacher, I thought she might be amused by the children, but I think I'd kind of forgotten how much rude language there is in it. And she was quite stunned by the experience.
So, or maybe it was, post-traumatic. She was remembering how terrible the kids really were.
Right.
Yes. To answer your question, though, about who was in the room, one of the really interesting things that we learned yesterday was that this particular part of the bank really struggling. And one of the things they had was 8 business analysts to 1 developer, which is a very rare proportion, I think we'll find. And that
developer, so many people telling him all the stuff he has to do, or her.
And he was really struggling to deliver anything that anyone wanted.
Like, reaches all over. Yeah. Get off of me.
Oh my.
So we had 1 developer in the room, obviously. We had testing people in there, and we had like a lot of delivery people. Another thing we learned was, and it sounds ridiculous, but I can imagine this happening in a lot of places, right? So we have a conversation about setting up cross-functional teams, cross-functional autonomous teams, co-located. They have, like many organizations, a third-party SI that they partner closely with. So co-location, not a problem, not possible. Okay, then let's use some tools. They can't even get the phones working properly. So forget kind of WebExes and things like that. That's a basic technological problem that they've got. But one of the other things that I found really interesting, I'm going to bat this back at Matthew in a minute, actually, is what I've seen quite a few times recently is companies that have done loads of automated testing. So they've got loads of tests, been automated, great, talking about coverage, they're talking about depths of tests, they're kind of saying our manual test that used to take us 10 days, we've now managed to automate that and it's now a matter of hours, and actually we've got a lot deeper and it's all brilliant. And then you have a conversation about continuous integration and you discover that none of these tests are being integrated into the pipeline. So there's a tight toe handle. For Matthew, you're nodding, so I'm guessing you've seen this as well in places.
Yeah, I mean, it's a misunderstanding of what we're trying to achieve with the deployment pipeline to an extent. I think some people see it as just a sort of a CI with a few extra bits, but what we're really talking about, it's software is not like manufacturing, right? But it's sort of the equivalent of a conveyor belt in the manufacturing, in the factory, and that's how we get our stuff out the door. If you're in a car manufacturing plant, you don't like take a piece of car off to one side and kind of manually kind of chip away at it or paint it. You've got the assembly line there for a very good reason, for repeatability.
Ferrari,
right.
Well, that's a different business model.
Unless you're doing something really bespoke. But if you're talking about wanting, if you want to make sure you've got repeatability in place, then we need to use this. Exactly. And in those cases, Helen, I think you're right. It probably indicates that the organization hasn't invested enough in getting the right kind of stuff into its deployment pipeline. But it hasn't really invested in understanding the benefits of making that deployment pipeline a really core thing about how they deploy. And so that's a really good it's a really good smell, if you like. Does the organization, how much of what the organization needs to do before it gets the software out of the door, how much of that stuff is in the deployment pipeline? And if it's less than 98% or whatever, then you got some work to do, because that should be the only way that we get stuff out of the door.
Yeah, right. Another kind of syndrome that I've run into is, well, yeah, but we never look at the results. We run those tests as part of our pipeline, but nobody ever checks them.
That's right, because they're flaky.
So we check the box that says we ran them, but we have no idea how well they ran or how many failed or if they're persistently failing. Or why bother?
And again, that's where you sort of need to treat that pipeline like it's a product. And you say, well, if you've got a feature in your product that no one is paying attention to, then there's no value being created by that feature in your product. So you need to fix it. Either get rid of it, or, which is what Gary Groover would say to do, hey, get rid of all the tests that are buggy and focus on the tests that are actually working, or fix the tests, right? Make sure that the feedback that you're giving to people is valuable feedback. Otherwise, like you said, they're going to just ignore it. Yeah, exactly. All right. So moving on. The 3 ways. So I think we covered some of this already, but we're stealing liberally from all the greats here. So this is, of course, from Gene Kim, talking about the 3 ways of DevOps. The first way is that systems level thinking, which Matthew talked about earlier, is, starting as far left as you can. And Helen said, yeah, you got to move that thing as far to the right as you can, including things like monitoring and whatever, to give you that end-to-end system level visibility. The second way to get those feedback loops and talk about the fact that it is a cycle. It's not a single pipeline. Once it gets into operations, there's lots of opportunity for us to sort of query that and find out how things are working. And then getting better at experimentation and at learning and keeping everything consistent so that, again, the things that you're putting in to the left-hand side of that system, whether it's an idea or a feature or whatever it is, that's the thing that you're able to track through that system and figure out whether the hypothesis you're making is going to work or not. I think that's an incredibly important part of this. How are you guys seeing this express itself in the folks that you're working with, these 3 ways from a pipeline perspective. And Matthew, I'll start with you this time.
So the way that I like to think about it, and the way that I recommend it for our clients, is to see the flow from development to operations. So the first way, to see that as provided by deployment pipelines. That's fundamentally the only way we get that flow is through deployment pipeline. The feedback from operation back into development, I see as telemetry, so logging and metrics and tracing and these kind of things. And therefore, they need to be fundamentally first-class things, but also they need to fundamentally to be wired up into development. Developers need to be able to see the data that's coming out of production systems. Now, if you need to, for compliance reasons, to mask some of that data, go ahead and mask the data. You know, it's 2018. We don't need to do this. Don't need to roll our own masking and stuff like that. This is out of the box in these tools these days. So we need to make that flow happen. That's how we get the awareness of what's happening in production. And then the continual experimentation in the middle. We've got to have logging and metrics and telemetry in all of our environments, on my developer laptop, in the test environment, in the kind of whatever it's called, UAT, pre-live environment. We have this telemetry in these environments because we want to get the fast feedback. It's not, you know, we don't just have a special production environment with special tooling. We have the same tooling everywhere, and we interact with these environments in the same way. So we get that fast feedback because we deploy into this environment, works fine. Deploy into this next environment using our deployment pipeline. We get some feedback from the telemetry. Oh, something's gone wrong. Why is that the case? I can quickly go and diagnose that problem. Maybe it's a problem with the deployment pipeline itself. Something's misconfigured, or it's run out of resources, or whatever. That's fine. I can use my tooling, my logging, and to look at the logs that are coming out of the deployment pipeline itself. That's fine. Or maybe it's a problem with the environments or whatever it is. Fine, and iterate quickly. Commit a change that addresses that the problem. See it flow through, and eventually it's ready for deployment into production. And I think a lot of organizations, certainly that I see, haven't really thought about the flow and the feedback in those terms. This means that deployment pipelines are absolutely fundamental. Telemetry is absolutely fundamental, and making both of those things happen across all the environments that we want to have in play is absolutely essential. And that's what, for me, that's what gives us the 3 ways of DevOps that Gene Kim talked about.
Yeah, I often kind of ask people to do a thought experiment. You know, you're getting ready to push the big red button to release your code, your wonderful new product that's going to change the world.
It's a big green button.
It's a big green button.
Just so you're aware, it's a green button.
But there's a problem. You know, there's an absolute showstopper problem. For the sake of argument, it's a 1-line fix. The engineer fixes it in 30 seconds, checks it in. Now, how long until you get back to where you just were before you discovered the bug? And what has to happen? And it's amazing how many organizations don't know even half the answer to that question. You know, is it days? Is it weeks? Is it hours? Is it minutes? Do we have to skip things in order for it not to take 12 weeks again? You know, so that now we're maybe skipping things that we shouldn't be skipping.
Right.
And that also turns around into, okay, there's a giant vulnerability that's been released, and, you know, OpenSSL or whatever, not to throw them under the bus, but, you know, there's been a few. You know, you gotta patch that, and you gotta patch that everywhere. How do you do that? And how long does it take you to do that as part of your pipeline? Or do you have to circumvent the pipeline to be able to do those kinds of things? And it's at the edges of those kinds of questions and scenarios where you start to find where the cracks are in the facade, and where the gaps in knowledge are, and those types of things. So,
Helen, your thoughts on the 3 ways?
So what you were kind of making me think about when you guys were chatting was really about the kind of 3rd way, and this appetite for experimentation and its relationship with failure as well. And you guys have all talked a little bit about it already, but this culture that we want to create in the DevOps world, where failure is seen as a good thing, where it's seen as a learning opportunity, and how many organizations struggle with that concept, understandably, because I think we're all brought up to think that failure is a little bit shameful and humiliating and not a good thing. But it's quite telling when we go into an organization and do some discovery and ask people how they feel about failure. You can tell quite a lot immediately about how forward-thinking that organisation is, and it's quite fun then to kind of have conversations with them about how to embrace failure a bit more. So I try and talk to them about kind of the safety culture element of it, and then the systemic safety part of it. So from the safety culture perspective, doing things like Spotify talk about having the fail walls, Etsy have the 3-arm jumper, and other organisations like Lego and Procter & Gamble, and people have awards for kind of most outrageously failed projects because it's shown that they've been adventurous and thoughtful in what they've tried to do. Another organisation, a smaller bank that we work with, one of the ladies from the learning community there had heard at a conference about people giving out Monopoly get out of jail free cards. So as a leader, you'd have them and you give them to the team and they give them back to you when they need an amnesty about something. So
nice.
like, clever tactical way of embedding that behaviour in. But then these people that are really, these leaders, sometimes I meet them and they're really dubious about failure. They're like, we cannot fail, we can't do it. We don't want a culture where people think they can get away with anything. Yeah, and they can't, you know, it doesn't matter if they don't hit their performance targets, that kind of stuff. We then have to have the systemic failure or the systemic safety conversation with them as well, and how much a continuous delivery pipeline or a DevOps toolchain protects them from it at all levels. So everything that Matthew's talked about in terms of doing all that testing early and knowing soon, all the way through to the telemetry that preempts us and tells us something's happening, the deployment automation tools that allow us to redeploy last known good state in a pattern that we know worked previously, and we can do it really, really quickly. All of the architectural decisions we can make around things like canary testing and blue-green and things like that that allow us to have limited blast radius or have a very simple platform before we press go on it. You know, there are so many things that we can do in the DevOps canon that help us prevent failure. So we can start from that point of wanting to experiment without fear.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder, it's funny because when I graduated from university and I went to work sort of professionally, one thing that struck me, and I wonder how much of this sort of fear of failure is kind of part of the educational model, because you only take the test once, you only turn in the paper once, you get the one grade, and then you're done. You move on to the next thing. In industry, that's not how it works. You ship 1.0, you ship 1.01, you ship the next one, the next one, the next one, and you build on failure and hopefully learn from it and get better. But I think part of it is from the educational system, is we've kind of been not educated to learn how to fail and fail fast and learn from it. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not an expert in that.
But seems
reasonable. But I play one on TV. Right.
I play one on a podcast. Right on. Yeah, exactly. Okay, very good. So definitely 3 ways applies here. And so if we're talking about the ability to experiment, the ability to sort of try and find the rocks that you can anchor yourself around when you're trying to model these things, regardless of where you end up using them. What are those types of things that you want to try and model? What are those anchor points in your pipeline? And how are you seeing people leverage that as they're creating these deployment pipelines, these continuous delivery pipelines for the folks who are more embedded, or folks who need to have sort of the government folks? We work with lots of folks in government where there needs to be an air-gapped environment for these deployments. These are, mission critical systems that when they're running are completely turned off, shut down, and not accessible from the broader network, but you still need to have some predictable way of getting that software in there. So what are those types of things that people should be paying attention to and modeling and abstracting out as part of that process, so that they can maintain that consistency while at the same time allowing some evolution or some adaptability to what they're doing? And who did I start with last time? I forget. Who was I?
I forget too.
All right, I'll start. Matthew, I'm going to start with you.
You got a 50-50 chance.
Yes.
So the first thing clearly is our artifacts that we're going to deploy, whatever they are. So that could be a jar file, it can be a NuGet package, or a Ruby gems package, or more recently it's going to be container images. And that's the thing that's our unit of deployment in effect.
Yep.
That's the thing which should remain
Immutable.
Should remain immutable. It should remain unchanged. We build it once, and it's the same in multiple environments. Now that is a position where some organizations still haven't quite got there yet. They have maybe 2 different builds: a dev build and then a release build, which might work for them, but there's a lot of value from getting to the point where we're just building it once, and if necessary, like you said before, throw it away if it's not good enough. Then we've got the different configuration that we need to apply in different environments, whatever environment means, right? So I'm actually sort of exploring this at the moment in the context of serverless, because in the context of serverless, what is an environment exactly like, and what's the collection of stuff that makes that? It's some of the rules that we've been used to before in terms of, you know, long running servers. We need to check their health, or we need to check the health of the application. Doesn't quite apply in the serverless context. So the patterns there, I think, are still emerging. What we mean by kind of environments and configuration and things like that, but they exist nonetheless in some sort of form. We've got a set of
serverless itself is an abstraction, right? Containers
sure,
themselves are an abstraction, and there's value, that immutability of them, and that just I push this button, I get this cookie. That consistency again is something that people can lean into as they're leaning out.
I think the
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, actually, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, fine. It's useful to consider external endpoints, whatever they are. So particularly if they're fully outside your organizational boundary. But actually, to be honest, there comes a point where, particularly if you follow kind of Conway's law and a nice segmentation of domain boundaries and keep teams kind of isolated in a good way along the right kind of domain boundaries, then even internal endpoints that we treat sort of in the same way as external endpoints, because they're just another endpoint that's outside of our kind of team's main. So we've got a concept of kind of which endpoints do we need to interact with, what logically are they, but also obviously for given environments, what's the actual address of the endpoint and all that sort of stuff. So that not only have we got concepts, have we dealt with the configuration of our world, but we've got the concept of what do we actually depend on as well. So the kind of runtime dependencies, as well as presumably the dependency we've pulled in at build time, and keeping those two things as quite important separate concepts is really important, particularly as we start to connect to many more things in a kind of microservices-y, small services type world.
Yeah, that separation of the concerns, whether that concern is the infrastructure and the artifact. You want to be able to experiment with both of them independently. I think this is where you're going, so that I'm not changing the artifact, but I'm changing the environment. What happens? I'm not changing the environment, but I'm changing the artifact. What happens?
Exactly.
To have that rock, to have that solid point of reference to say nothing else should have changed and nothing else should be broken when I do this. If something breaks, it's because of the artifact, or it's because of
and to be able to swap out one particular implementation of an endpoint for another. So if we're shifting from EBS or something to S3, it's just storage, right? At one level, but another level is an important difference. But we should be able to abstract that thing, and then we swap it out around the back, run the test again. It should still work. That's all fine. Let's move on. So it's really important that we treat our kind of deployment pipelines as we put the same kind of thinking and effort into it as we would do with software architecture, because it's software that we're building. We've got to have the right abstractions, the right interfaces in the right place, and sensible domain boundaries that are common in the industry, if you like.
Right.
Artifacts are common, kind of environment configuration is common, endpoints are a common thing, and
because we've heard of Amazon over here too. It's not just over in the UK. It's pretty common stuff. Yeah.
I think too the notion of having an electronic bill of materials is becoming a little bit more pervasive, and then if for no other reason than safety, security, vulnerability, all of those kinds of things, to say, okay, Struts vulnerability, where are we using that version? Let's patch it. Let's fix it. And it's still a little bit depressing how slowly that happens still, and how kind of ad hoc those kinds of processes still are for very important pieces of software still. But we're getting better. We're getting better. But you have to know what you're using where, so that when there's a problem with it, you can come up with a plan to ameliorate or fix, or do whatever you have to do to get around it.
Helen, what are your thoughts on this? We've talked kind of exhaustively about it, but I'm hoping that you'll have some nugget that you've been sitting on.
So just picking up on the last point that I think Matthew was making around properly architecting your tool chain. I see so many organizations where a development team have recognized there is a better way to do stuff, and they have started automating build and then started automating a bit of test. And it quite quickly becomes a bit out of hand. And in the larger organisations, we see multiple teams doing this all independently. And then it gets really messy, and we go in and we discover they've got everything. They've got Puppet Chef and Ansible, they've got TeamCity and Jenkins, and they've got every flavour of anything you can possibly imagine. So it kind of gives us a couple of challenges, and we don't want everyone to use the same tool set. Of course we don't. We said that earlier. But when we've got lots of fragmentation, it doesn't help us move between teams because we might have to learn a new tool. It doesn't help us from an acquisition perspective, because free as some tools are initially, most tools will ask you for some money for enterprise support, because we live in a world that is driven by
commercials. Or free as in puppy is what I like to. Andy Man, that's a hat tip to Andy Man. Free as in puppy. There you go. It's free.
So, you know, we've got these challenges, and you know, some people, like you say, will be using Java, then people are using mainframes and Kix COBOL or all sorts of other things, or some people are doing a mobile app. So there's all sorts of different variations. But there's a great bit in the DevOps handbook, just to reference that again, where they talk about actually asking ops to provide the tool chain as a shared service. And that's the model we would always try and encourage people towards. Architect it up front, have ops understand it, understand what those component parts of the pipeline are going to be, and then understand if you need to change from JUnit to XUnit or whatever it is for the different flavors of pipeline, but to provide that centrally as a service. So when we talk about DevOps toolchain modeling, that's really what we're trying to encourage people to do. But I think it is really hard for organizations out there because there aren't many blueprints. So there's an exercise we do in our DevOps Foundation course where we get people to architect their current pipeline, and we kind of pick holes in it and look for gaps in it. And security is a classic one. You know, a lot of people aren't doing app security very well early on in the pipeline and things like that. Get that kind of software hygiene that Anders was just talking about. So I think there is definitely room for people to be in the S of calms, more sharing about their blueprints for their pipelines. We stood up a little LinkedIn group to try and encourage it. Sonatype recently published a set of reference architectures for DevSecOps that they'd created, but helping there be some sort of common understanding of what those component parts are and what the options are. And I think that's becoming easier. I think 3 years ago, there were just so many tools and different flavors. And I think the market's starting to settle a bit. So we kind of know who the big 3 or 4 players in each category, if you like.
I love what you said there, the Sonatype guys. I think that the idea of a model giving you a framework that you can work from, even if it's not accurate, even if it's not right, allowing everyone to work from that model and then pick holes in it and say, hey, there's a problem here, and there's this visual representation, or there's this concreteness to the model, where you can see how what you're doing fits in and how other people fit in and why there's different, and how it's a very valuable tool for us to be able to leap from and say, okay, here's where I can make things better.
The great thing about frameworks is they give us context for discussion. The really dangerous thing about frameworks is people look at them and then try and apply them exactly to what they've got. You know, we hear people, everyone moans about ITIL because they tried to translate ITIL to their exact environment. We've got customers who are trying to copy the Spotify model, and we're like, no, don't copy the model. Try and understand what it is you're trying to do.
Right. Yeah. Why?
What outcomes are, and then we'll work back from there.
Yeah, I think self-service models are becoming more prevalent and very powerful too, in terms of if I need an environment to do some testing, you know, should I have to go through the architecture committee again? Should I have to go through SecOps again? You know, even though it's the same as last time. So providing all of the things that are kind of blessed and well known and all of those kinds of things, as self-service type services is very powerful. It takes a lot of the weight states out for people, and we still spend a lot of time just waiting on environments, waiting on builds, waiting on tests, waiting on people, waiting on Godot. You know.
I agree with you. I think that there's a couple of things that I've seen that can be real enablers. One is this self-service kind of pipelines as a service, if you like. That needs some some greater maturity in some of the platform teams than many organizations have, which is we actually need to kind of really treat this platform as a product and need to understand our users, our customers, if you like, our development teams, testers, BAs, software developers, and actually treat them like that and reach out and understand what their needs are and go and listen to what they're saying they need and respond in an appropriate way. So we have a product owner for our kind of for our platform and its capabilities. That's it's a step up for lots of kind of traditional sort of platform or sysadmin teams. But the additional part, which I think many organizations miss, is giving space for people, or even sometimes a whole team, a dedicated team, as a kind of enablement for continuous delivery practices, to make sure there's space for them to actually work with different, particularly in large organizations where you've got like 20, 50 development teams, to enable a group of people who either they come together as a community or a guild or something like this, or it's an actual team that actually spends time working with other teams to help them understand new ways of doing things, to help them understand why they should adopt a pattern of semantic versioning for their artifacts, for example, and help them guide them through it. Why they should actually now move from kind of, what was your phrase, Helen? Dangerous scripted monster. Right, so move from that kind of way of doing things, which was okay, but it doesn't scale. Move from that to something like, let's say, model-driven pipelines instead, and help them understand why they need to relearn some of this stuff, or why they need to throw away some of the scripts, because it brings these benefits, and maybe give them a kind of a leg up, if you like, or a helping hand to move into a better way of doing stuff. And a lot of organizations seem not to invest the time and people in that kind. It's like oil in the machine. It's not a huge number of people, but it's just enough oil to make things happen. I think that's also quite important, particularly when, as we said, we're moving from older ways or more manual ways of doing things into ways of doing things which are much more kind of industrialized and to some extent standardized, because it's doing a lot of the boilerplate work. Helping people understand why that's a good thing to do is really important.
Exactly. And the fact that Helen mentioned that sort of the Noah's Ark of DevOps tools that most companies end up with, they've got two of every kind. And it's not because the outcomes are vastly different between a chef and a puppet. It's just because that's what the person chose, right? That's what they understood. So figuring out as a service, all right, I understand that folks are out there now and they're using these different tools to get these different outcomes. Let's focus on what the outcomes need to be. And then as an enterprise, let's focus on, well, what's the best way for us to get those outcomes? Is it to have 50,000 different products that help us with that? Or is it to have one product with one enterprise license? And then we abstract the need for the teams to be, they can still put the stickers on their laptops and be like, yeah, I love this tool. But at the end of the day, that's actually not the tool we chose. But you're still getting the outcome you want, which is a machine that's configured exactly the way you want it. You've got that fidelity of that environment, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. So I think that's a very powerful part of that environments as a service, the pipelines as a service that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, we have one more topic. We're sort of running out of time, but I think this is an important one, and we've already talked about it a little bit. It's connecting that model then to the real world, to these tools that people are using. And I think we basically covered it. I think, Helen, you did a very good job of sort of talking about it already. Is there anything else that you guys would want to, I guess, Helen, I'll start with you. Anything else that you want to sort of talk about when you take these models and you're thinking, okay, now how do I apply it across this Noah's Ark of tools that we have? What are some of the things that you're seeing that's working with your clients when they're trying to abstract away those different tools?
I touched on this earlier, but a really key thing when we're helping people model tool chains is to think of it as a loop rather than a linear A to B process. And I learned that because I was stood up at a conference and I had a representation of the SDLC that I'd used for years and years and years. I used to work at IBM with Lotus Notes, actually, so I loved it when you talked about that. And someone in the audience said that doesn't look very DevOps. And a lot of people like the kind of figure of 8 on its side, but I don't particularly like that because I feel that it separates Dev and Ops out. And what we're really trying to do is blend that whole process together. So I like to use a loop. And as I said earlier, I really like to help people think from the idea to the value realization element of that. So what we're starting to see with some of our more advanced customers, one particular insurer that we work with in the UK, It's things like providing AI, so echoes in the CMO's office, so CMO can come in and query Alexa as to the conversion rate, the policy conversion rate on the website. So we're starting to see some really advanced uses of the tool chain, and I know that people like Dynatrace are working on things like allowing you to write value into a user story in Jira, and then using an application performance management tool to query the website and look all the way back to that user story and understand if the value outcome that was anticipated is being realized or not. So that's really kind of where we're taking people with tools now. But on the other side of the coin, we still have plenty of customers, like I described earlier, that are struggling even to get the basics of CI. So people that are listening, kind of don't worry if way off, because
if you're not doing the advanced math yet, that's okay. You're among friends. Yeah. Matthew, what are your thoughts? You're muted, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was muted. So my thoughts are these, that that if you're in a position where you can take advantage of some of these more advanced practices, particularly around model-based pipelines and some of the fancy value tracking stuff, that's really awesome. And you know, get into meetups and conference circuits and talk about it, because it's great to hear those kind of stories and help everyone else to get out of the kind of swamp where many of these organizations are. But for other organizations, really it's we've got to put the basics in. We've got to have logging and metrics, that basic telemetry across all environments. We've got to have deployment pipelines, which are the only way to get from code into live. We've got to make sure that all our tests run in the deployment pipeline. We don't have some random stuff that sits outside of it. This is everything that we need to ship our stuff. It's also the time between commit and being in production could be short enough to deal with zero-day vulnerabilities, like you said before. And a small one-line code change, it's that quick if we need to. It's also, but it could also do a whole new feature, a whole new version. That's also fine. But these are all like really core practices, and there's a lot to learn. But there isn't really a shortcut. We can't just skip some of this stuff. We can't skip proper continuous integration. We can't stop proper continuous delivery practices. You can't just short circuit it. We've got to put these things in place. But of course, if we've gone through the foundational stuff, we get to the point where actually if we get to the point where our dangerous script monster is becoming the blocker, that's actually kind of a good place to be, if you like, because we've dealt with a whole lot of other things. We've got our foundations in place, and then we can look at some more advanced tooling. So, but we have to make sure we've got the foundations in there as well.
Yeah. When that becomes your big bottleneck, that's good. You've eliminated a lot of the other big bottlenecks. One thing that's also interesting is when we talk about tools, your existing scripts, you can sort of think about that like a tool. And if you can abstract that script out and have that script, you can use the same script that you have, but if you're having it part of an orchestrated pipeline and you're feeding it parameters or you're feeding it whatever you need to feed it in a consistent way, then you get a lot more consistency out of that script monster, right? And once you've got it as part of your pipeline as a service or part of your product, what can you start to do? You can start refactoring it. You can start untangling that script monster, but you're doing it in a way that's abstracted away from the people that are using it, so they never have to be impacted. Again, back to your point, Matthew, about the fact that these guys are your customers, the developers and the operations people. They're your customers. And so by abstracting away all the messiness of that script that they had helped you create, it gives you the ability to lean it out over time.
Yeah. I mean, you may need to replace the foundation of your house and still live in the house. So you kind of have to lift it up,
jack it up a little bit,
fix it, and then put it back down. And that's kind of sometimes what you need to do with your pipeline. Jack it up.
Yeah, that's right.
Fix it and put it back down.
Yeah,
gives you a little bit of space to do that, which is always good.
Excellent. All right. So the last thing that I wanted to cover, and this has been a fantastic conversation. The last thing that I wanted to cover is some workshops that we're doing. Helen is going to be gracing us our presence right after DevOps Enterprise Summit. She and Gary Groover, who is one of our advisors, are doing a seminar, and it's going to be your DevOps Essentials class in the morning. Helen, do you want to spend a minute and talk a little bit about what that entails?
Yeah, kind of what it says on the tin. So short class, for kind of beginners, if you like. It's DevOps fundamentals or foundation, but just a few hours talking about things like the 3 ways and CALMs and why we're here and what deployment pipeline looks like. So the basics.
Very good. We're looking forward to that. And then following that, for folks who say, yeah, you know what, I really just need to learn the basics, and then I want to be able to bring that back into my organization and help start leading that process, the same things that I've learned at DevOps Enterprise Summit by hearing these stories from these leaders who are bringing these principles. And again, Matthew and Helen just talked about it. These are not, they seem obvious in hindsight, but until you've seen them and until you've had the ability to see them in hindsight, they're not always obvious. And so to provide a session, a workshop, a hands-on workshop where people can come in and feel free to ask questions and learn the basics, and then how you apply those basics, how do I bring that back into my own organization and help other folks see those basics as well. We're going to be running that immediately following Does UK for those that are joining us, so please do. John Willis is also going to be doing a full-day workshop on DevSecOps, where it's a technical hands-on workshop where people can actually show up, get an instance of a pipeline that they can play with a vulnerable artifact that we're going to deploy into real-life environments. Will cause some catastrophic damage to lots of different infrastructure all over the world. It's going to be very exciting. Actually, that's not going to actually happen, but we'll show you how that could happen. And then we're going to start iterating on that pipeline to introduce more quality control in the form of security controls earlier and earlier in that pipeline, and learn stuff about how you actually educate your developers to code more in a more secure manner, as well as how do you enable a pipeline that will allow that security to just be as a service, bake it into that pipeline. So that's it. I want to thank everybody for joining us. This is a fantastic conversation. And we'll see everybody on the next continuous discussions. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.